The stars above the Orion sector shimmered in the cold void of space, untouched by time, but today they would witness history. The Galactic Dominion's fleet, a vast armada of warships forged from centuries of conquest, moved like a monstrous tide, swallowing the darkness in its path. These ships, sleek and bristling with energy weapons, had crushed countless civilizations, leaving only silence in their wake. Their shields, the strongest in the known galaxy, had never been breached. Their energy cannons, powerful enough to vaporize entire warships in seconds, had never failed. To them, humanity was nothing more than a footnote in history, a minor species that had somehow managed to survive longer than it should have. But now, the Dominion had decided to end the human resistance once and for all. The Armada advanced, their commanders confident that this would be just another routine extermination. Admiral Lee stood on the bridge of the TDS Valiant, the flagship of the Terran Defense Fleet, watching the Dominion ships through the holographic display. His face remained calm, his eyes calculating, but deep inside, he knew the reality of the situation. The enemy fleet outnumbered them nearly 5-1. Their weapons were considered the pinnacle of technological advancement. Their shields had never been breached by any known force. And yet, Lee wasn't afraid. He had studied the Dominion's tactics for years, watched how they crushed their enemies, how they relied on energy-based warfare, how they had never needed to adapt because no one had ever forced them to. They were powerful, but they were predictable. And predictable enemies could be defeated. The Dominion's war marshal, Corinne, stood on the bridge of his own warship, a towering vessel known as the Doombringer, an appropriate name for a ship that had reduced entire worlds to ashes. He looked at the human fleet with nothing but disdain. Their ships were primitive, clunky things with solid armor instead of elegant energy shielding. They still relied on projectiles, a technology so outdated that most advanced civilizations had abandoned it centuries ago. To Corinne, this was not a battle. This was a formality. The Terran fleet would crumble, their colonies would burn, and the Dominion would move on, stronger than ever. With a flick of his hand, he gave the order. The first wave of Dominion ships surged forward, energy cannons charging, their weapons locking onto the human vessels. A final lesson in Dominion superiority was about to begin. Lee watched the enemy movements closely. Everything was going exactly as he had expected. The Dominion believed their shields made them invincible. They believed energy weapons were the only way to fight. But they had never faced what Lee was about to unleash. Taking a deep breath, he gave the command. All ships, prepare to fire. Engage railguns. The Dominion ships fired first, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the battle would end as expected. Blinding beams of energy streaked through the void, slamming into the human fleet. Some ships took damage, their armor melting under the intense heat, but unlike the Dominion's usual victims, they did not explode. They endured. And then, the humans fired back. The first railgun round struck a Dominion warship at 10% of light speed. The kinetic slug, no larger than a car, bypassed the ship's energy shields as if they didn't exist and ripped through the hull like paper. The ship didn't just take damage, it was torn apart, the impact sending molten debris flying in all directions. A second shot followed, then a third, then a dozen. In the span of seconds, 3 Dominion warships were obliterated. Panic rippled through the enemy ranks. This was impossible. Their shields had always been their greatest defense, yet they had just watched them fail without explanation. Corinne's eyes widened in shock as his fleet's communications filled with distress signals. They have some kind of new weapon. One of his commanders shouted, "Their projectiles, our shields aren't stopping them." Corinne clenched his fists. How? How had these primitives developed a weapon that ignored the very foundation of Dominion warfare? But Admiral Lee knew the answer. The Dominion had built their empire on energy warfare. Their shields could deflect plasma, absorb laser fire, and disrupt particle beams, but they had never been designed to stop solid metal moving at near light speed. The railguns fired again, their projectiles invisible in the vacuum of space, but their effects undeniable. Dominion warships exploded one after another, their hulls crumpling under the relentless kinetic bombardment. The battlefield, once dominated by the glowing brilliance of energy weapons, was now littered with burning wreckage, torn metal, and the debris of a once invincible fleet. For the first time in history, the Dominion was losing. Corinne refused to accept it. He barked orders, commanding his remaining forces to regroup, to unleash their full firepower on the human ships. More energy beams lit up the darkness, but they were no longer met with helpless resistance. Lee's fleet moved with precision, dodging, repositioning, and continuing their assault. The Dominion ships, used to facing weaker opponents who crumbled in minutes, had never fought an enemy like this before, an enemy who studied them, who adapted, who found a way to break them. As another Dominion battleship was ripped apart by a direct railgun hit, Corinne realized the truth. This was not a fluke. This was not luck. Humanity had rewritten the rules of warfare. And if they didn't change their strategy soon, this battle would not just be a defeat, it would be a massacre. But Lee wasn't done yet. He had planned for this moment, for the enemy's panic, for their desperation. This was only the beginning. The real battle was about to start, and he would make sure the galaxy never forgot what happened next. The battlefield was not silent. The wreckage of Dominion warships drifted across the void, twisted metal glowing faintly from the heat of destruction. Fire flickered inside some of the shattered hulls, struggling against the emptiness of space. The human fleet, smaller but still intact, remained in formation, their railguns cooling after the first devastating barrage. On the bridge of the TDS Valiant, Admiral Lee stood with his arms crossed, watching the aftermath of his strategy unfold. He could already imagine the fear spreading through the Dominion's command ranks. They had never lost like this before. They had never even imagined that such a loss was possible. But this was only the beginning. The Dominion was powerful, and they would not accept defeat easily. The next wave was coming, and this time, they would not be caught off guard. Lee needed to make sure humanity was ready. Across the battlefield, the remaining Dominion warships regrouped, trying to recover from the shocking turn of events. War Marshal Corinne, humiliated and enraged, slammed his fist against the command table on his bridge. The Doombringer had survived the initial assault, but many of his best ships had been reduced to debris in mere moments. The reports made no sense. Their shields, the strongest in the known galaxy, had done nothing. The enemy's weapons were crude, simple projectiles fired at high speeds, yet they had cut through Dominion warships as if they were made of glass. Corinne's officers scrambled to analyze the data, searching for an explanation, but the truth was already clear. Humanity had found a weakness in their technology, and they had exploited it mercilessly. Corinne knew that if he did not act fast, this battle could spiral into a catastrophe. He had underestimated these humans, just like everyone else in the Dominion. That was a mistake he would not make again. His fleet had superior numbers, superior firepower, and centuries of battle experience. If the humans wanted to rely on brute force projectiles, then he would show them the true power of Dominion warfare. He issued new orders. His fleet would spread out, forcing the human ships to divide their firepower. His battleships would maneuver erratically, making it harder for the railguns to land precise shots. And above all, they would attack with overwhelming force. Energy cannons charged again, plasma torpedoes locked onto their targets, and the Dominion warships surged forward in a furious counterattack. Lee saw the shift in strategy instantly. The enemy was adapting, trying to counter the effectiveness of the railguns. Their ships no longer moved in tight formations, making it more difficult to strike multiple targets at once. They were weaving through space unpredictably, forcing human gunners to adjust their aim with every shot. It was a smart response, but Lee had planned for this. He had spent months perfecting railgun warfare, knowing that the Dominion would eventually realize its mistake. The solution had already been prepared. "Fleet, adjust targeting algorithms," he commanded, his voice calm but firm. His officers worked quickly, implementing the changes. The human fleet's AI-assisted targeting systems adapted, calculating new firing solutions in real time. The Dominion ships were fast, but they were not faster than railgun projectiles moving at 10% of light speed. The next volley was fired, and despite the enemy's best efforts, the destruction continued. A Dominion battlecruiser took a direct hit along its spine, the kinetic slug tearing through its entire length before exiting the other side. A second ship tried to dodge, but the human AI predicted its movement, and the next railgun shot slammed into its engines, causing an immediate explosion. The Dominion fleet fired back, unleashing everything they had. Energy beams streaked through space, some finding their marks, others missing entirely as the human ships executed precision maneuvers. One Terran frigate was hit, its hull melting under the intense heat, but it held together long enough to fire a final railgun shot that obliterated a Dominion destroyer before it was consumed in an explosion. Lee clenched his jaw. Every loss was painful, but they were trading ships at a ratio the Dominion had never experienced before. For every human ship that fell, 5 or 6 Dominion vessels were destroyed. Corinne watched in disbelief as his fleet continued to crumble. The humans had countered his adjustments almost instantly. He had underestimated them once, and he had paid the price, but now he understood this was no ordinary enemy. This was a species that had spent its entire history fighting against impossible odds and winning. They had built their technology not for elegance or efficiency, but for destruction and survival. And now, that same brutal ingenuity was turning one of the greatest Dominion fleets into wreckage. The War Marshal had only one option left. He activated a secure command channel and called for reinforcements. The Dominion's Dreadnought Squadron was stationed nearby massive, heavily armored warships, equipped with superweapons, capable of destroying entire planets. They were too large to move quickly, but once they arrived, their overwhelming firepower would turn the tide. Humanity's railguns might be devastating against ordinary warships, but no projectile weapon could break through the sheer bulk of a Dominion dreadnought. Lee's fleet continued its relentless attack, but his scanners soon detected something massive approaching from hyperspace. His officers quickly confirmed what he already suspected the Dominion was calling in their ultimate weapons. He stared at the data on his screen, considering his next move. The dreadnoughts were unlike anything his fleet had faced before, but Lee was not the kind of man to back down. He had planned for this as well. His officers turned to him, waiting for orders. He could see the uncertainty in their eyes. The railgun strategy had worked so far, but against the dreadnoughts, they had no guarantee of success. The enemy believed their sheer size and armor would make them unstoppable. But Lee knew better. Every ship had a weakness. Every enemy had a flaw. And he was going to find it. Taking a deep breath, he gave the command. All ships, reload railguns. Prepare for the next phase. The battle was far from over. The Dominion still believed they could win, but humanity had already changed the rules of war. The real test was about to begin. And Admiral Lee was ready. The vast expanse beyond Saturn's largest moon, Titan, was a graveyard of silence. The human fleet lay hidden in the thick rings of the gas giant, their warships drifting like shadows among the frozen debris. Admiral Lee stood on the command deck of the TDS Valiant, his eyes locked on the holographic display. His fleet was outnumbered. The Dominion's invasion force was approaching, their massive warships glowing with the eerie blue light of charged energy cannons. This was no ordinary skirmish. This was an ambush, carefully orchestrated to turn the tide of war. Humanity had been on the defensive for too long. Tonight, that would change. The Dominion fleet moved with confidence, their towering dreadnoughts leading the formation. War Marshal Corinne stood on the bridge of the Doombringer, his cold reptilian eyes scanning the empty void ahead. The human forces had been sighted retreating toward Titan days ago, and now they were nowhere to be seen. A lesser commander might have suspected a trap, but Corinne dismissed the thought. Humanity had fought bravely, but they had never shown the strategic brilliance required for deception on this scale. Their ships relied on crude railguns, powerful but slow. Against the Dominion's energy-based weaponry, their primitive tactics would fail. Corinne smiled. This would be nothing more than a routine extermination. But Admiral Lee had spent months preparing for this moment. He knew the Dominion's arrogance would blind them. He had studied their fleet movements, analyzed their attack patterns, and now they were walking straight into his trap. The enemy fleet drifted closer, unaware of the silent hunters hiding within Saturn's rings. The moment had come. With a steady breath, Lee gave the order. All ships, fire. the void erupted in light. From the darkness of the rings, the human fleet unleashed hell. Railguns, already locked onto their targets, fired in perfect synchronization. Kinetic slugs, traveling at 10% of light speed, tore through the Dominion's front line before they even had a chance to react. The first wave of enemy cruisers exploded instantly, their hulls shredded by the sheer force of the impact. Fire and debris scattered into space as panic rippled through the Dominion fleet. Corinne's confident smirk vanished. His warships had never been attacked like this before. The human fleet had remained hidden until the last second, and now his forces were taking devastating losses. He shouted orders, demanding a counterattack, but chaos had already spread. His frontline warships were either destroyed or crippled, and the ones behind them scrambled to evade the incoming fire. The Dominion fleet was fractured, their perfect formation shattered within moments. Lee didn't give them time to recover. He had spent years fighting superior enemies. He knew that hesitation meant death. All ships, advance. Cut off their retreat. The human fleet surged forward, railguns firing relentlessly, punching holes through the enemy ranks. More Dominion ships fell, their shields useless against the unstoppable power of kinetic energy. But the Dominion was not defeated yet. Corinne, regaining control, ordered his remaining ships to fire everything at the human fleet. Bright beams of energy sliced through the void, striking several Terran vessels. One frigate was vaporized instantly, while another suffered catastrophic damage, its engines failing as it spun into the wreckage of a destroyed Dominion cruiser. The humans were winning, but the battle was far from over. Lee narrowed his eyes as he watched the Dominion fleet adjust. Corinne was pulling his forces back, regrouping around his dreadnoughts. Those colossal warships, thick with armor and bristling with weapons, were the true monsters of the Dominion's fleet. If they were allowed to retaliate, even a victory here could turn into a disaster. Lee knew what he had to do. Target the dreadnoughts, he ordered. His fleet obeyed, redirecting their railgun fire toward the enemy's largest and most powerful ships. The first shot struck one of the dreadnoughts near the center, punching through its outer hull and rupturing its internal decks. The massive warship shuddered, its engines failing as it began to list. Another railgun shot followed, then another. A second dreadnought was hit, its bridge obliterated in an instant. For the first time in history, Dominion dreadnoughts were falling. Corinne watched in horror. The dreadnoughts were supposed to be invincible. Their armor was designed to withstand anything except this. Railgun slugs, moving at incomprehensible speeds, ignored armor, ignored shields, ignored everything. They simply tore through whatever stood in their way. The Dominion had spent centuries perfecting energy warfare, but it had never prepared for this. Rage clouded Corinne's thoughts, but he knew he had only one choice left. His forces were broken. The ambush had destroyed too many of his warships, and the dreadnoughts were being ripped apart one by one. If he stayed, the entire fleet would be annihilated. With a deep growl, he gave the order he had never imagined giving. All ships, retreat. The surviving Dominion warships turned and fled. Some tried to cover their escape, firing at the human fleet in desperation. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. Admiral Lee exhaled as he watched the enemy vanish into the dark. His fleet had suffered losses, but today humanity had won. The Dominion had been defeated not in open war, but through strategy, through precision, through a revolution in space combat. The ambush at Titan's Edge would be remembered for generations as the day humanity proved it would not be conquered. The war was far from over, but one thing was certain: the galaxy would never see humans the same way again. The battle had stretched on for hours. Wreckage from both fleets drifted in the dark void, silent reminders of the brutal war that had raged between humanity and the Dominion. Explosions flickered in the distance as warships on both sides continued their desperate struggle. But Admiral Lee knew the truth: this battle was reaching its final moments. The Dominion had thrown everything they had into this last engagement, believing that their sheer numbers and firepower would crush humanity once and for all. But they had underestimated one thing: humanity's ability to adapt. On the bridge of the TDS Valiant, the Dominion's fleet was still vast, but it was no longer invincible. Their dreadnoughts had suffered heavy damage, their smaller vessels were in disarray, and their once perfect formations had collapsed under relentless railgun fire. But humanity was not unscathed. Many Terran ships had been lost. Some of the finest captains and crews had given their lives to hold the line. And now, as the battle approached its end, Lee had one final move left to play. The Dominion War Marshal, Corinne, paced angrily aboard the bridge of the Doombringer, his reptilian eyes glowing with fury. He had never known defeat on this scale. His forces had dominated the galaxy for centuries, and yet these humans, this young, reckless species, had shattered the Dominion's aura of invincibility. Their primitive railguns had torn through his most powerful warships. Their unpredictable tactics had thrown his battle-hardened admirals into confusion. He had thought this war would be a mere formality, a reminder to all species that the Dominion ruled without challenge. But now he faced a reality he could not accept. The Dominion was losing, and unless he acted now, they would never recover. Corinne bared his sharp teeth in frustration. He had one last weapon, the Annihilator-class warship, the Tyrant's Wrath. It had remained in reserve, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Its weapon systems were unlike anything the humans had encountered before. It could wipe out their fleet in a single, devastating barrage. But if he committed it now, it would be his last gambit. If it failed, there would be no more second chances. Lee's eyes narrowed as his scanners detected the Tyrant's Wrath moving into position. He had been expecting this. The Dominion always held back a trump card, believing they could win with overwhelming force at the last moment. But he had prepared for this very scenario. Now, it was time to end this war. All ships, execute the final maneuver, Lee commanded. Across the battlefield, the human fleet suddenly shifted. Warships that had been scattered and seemingly disorganized began converging in perfect synchronization. Dominion captains, still reeling from their losses, watched in shock as the human fleet formed a deadly spearhead aimed directly at the Tyrant's Wrath. The Dominion's ultimate warship was powerful, but it was not invincible. Lee knew that if he allowed it to fire its main weapon, everything would be lost. The only way to win was to strike first. Corinne's claws dug into the command table as he realized what was happening. The humans were not retreating. They were coming straight for him. His officers shouted warnings, urging him to fall back, but Corinne silenced them with a growl. He would not run. He would not surrender. If the humans wanted to challenge the might of the Dominion's deadliest warship, then so be it. Corinne's fleet continued forward, unaware of the silent killers weaving through their formation. His commanders focused on the human warships ahead, preparing for what they thought would be a direct engagement. But as the first Dominion dreadnought powered its weapons, something went wrong. Explosions erupted from within the Dominion fleet. One of their warships suddenly lost power, its engines flickering before a chain reaction tore it apart from the inside. Another ship, one of their largest battle cruisers, had its shields disrupted before an unseen force ripped through its hull. Panic spread as Dominion captains shouted reports of unknown attackers inside their own ships. Corinne's eyes widened. This was not possible. The humans were attacking from within. He could not see them. He could not fight them. His warships, built for large-scale engagements, were completely helpless against an enemy they could not even detect. Lee watched it all unfold with calculated precision. The ghosts had done their job. Now, it was time to finish what they had started. All capital ships, Lee commanded. Fire at will. The human fleet opened fire, railguns launching kinetic slugs at terrifying speeds. With the Dominion fleet already crippled from within, their defenses fell apart. Shields failed, engines were destroyed, command bridges were obliterated. In mere minutes, what had been an unstoppable armada was nothing more than burning wreckage. Corinne clenched his fists. His warships were falling apart. His captains were screaming for orders, but there was nothing he could do. The old ways of war had failed. Lee leaned forward, his voice calm yet merciless. "Tell the war marshal," he said to his communication officer, "that the age of Dominion rule is over. This is a new era of warfare, and humanity is leading it. As the last of the Dominion ships tried to retreat, the ghosts struck again. The survivors never made it out of the battlefield. There would be no reinforcements. There would be no escape. And just like that, the war ended. The galaxy would never be the same. The old rules were gone. The species that once ruled with an iron fist had been outmatched not by brute strength, but by something far more terrifying ingenuity. Humanity had not just survived. They had evolved. And now they were unstoppable.